energy, Michael Scott. Fill the room.
Okay. Arguably one of the worst humanitarian crises in history, the rape of Nanking, depending on estimates, killed as many as 5 million to 15 million Chinese civilians. Persecuted mainly, almost entirely, by the Japanese military, it is perhaps the root of all causes and tensions between the two countries. And as the Guardian of September 13th, 2010 argues, may be one of the root causes of the most recent protests in both countries. Although there are also political, economic, and cultural elements, the rape of Nanking in both countries remains a scar on their psyche. And this protest continues and continues a horrible trend. If these two countries can't stop this continuous bickering, then two of the world's 3 largest economies will be at each other's throats, something they've been doing for the past 60 years and even longer. Clearly, these protests, if they're a sign of worsening relations, could be a disaster for Asia as a whole. With that in mind, it becomes vitally important that we ask this question. Are recent protests just the beginning of worsening Chinese-Japanese relations? Unfortunately, the answer is no, because old antagonisms are not nearly as strong as modern pressures, and these protests are largely conducted by fringe nationalist groups. We can see this for 3 key reasons. First, political ties in both countries are getting stronger. Second, economic relations are improving daily. And finally, cultural ties that both nations share have been getting stronger for years. As a political idea, relations between China and Japan have been at best frosty since the two countries first established their relations. However, fortunately and most recently, relations have been improving dramatically. And despite these recent protests, this trend looks likely to continue. The Financial Times of September 4th, 2010 points out that these two countries have, for the first time this year, had a grand total of 19 different summits of political leaders, where both countries went out and discussed key issues they share. This is not a sentimental or indeed a repercussionary action for past transgressions, but indeed, as pointed out by The Economist on September 3rd, 2010, a callous recognition of standing facts. Japan, because of the United States' recent qualms about having a military base in Okinawa, feels, as many politicians agree, in a sense, militarily vulnerable, whereas China, confident in strength and willing to exert it, has a rapidly expanding navy and overall political hegemony. These two countries have now recognized that instead of competing with one another as they have in the past, cooperation, albeit on a relatively frosty level, is a far better alternative. And as pointed out by The Guardian of September 9th, 2010, over the long run, this could have dramatic and important and positive repercussions in countries like North Korea and Myanmar, where both countries have a more or less similar interest in promoting peace and stability. Political ties are all well and good, but unless they're backed up by economics, little ever changes. Fortunately for these countries, and despite these protests, economic ties have gotten substantially better in recent times. The Boston Globe, September 3rd, 2010, points out that one of the main causes for these protests is in both countries a sense that the other is conspiring against them in an economic sense. In China, the sense is that Japan is attempting to subvert many Chinese corporations, whereas Japan feels China is subverting many of their economic domestic moves. Clearly, there's tension on both sides, but fortunately, as pointed out by the International Herald Tribune of September 2nd, 2010, economic ties, despite these protests, have been both beneficial for both these countries and are rapidly expanding annually. Most importantly, in the terms of shipping. Japan has one of the world's largest shipping fleets, and China is one of the world's largest manufacturers. China is almost completely dependent on Japan for the utilization of these shipping fleets. And as the Brookings Institute points out in its summer 2010 publication, that's one of the most important things keeping these two countries together, as much as 45% all Chinese goods are shipped out of the country on Japanese fleets. Now, these protests underline a clear cultural tension between both countries, but fortunately, cultural ties have been getting better and better in recent years. As pointed out by the Japan Times of September 3rd, 2010, one important thing to recognize is that one of the lead protesters in China, Sung Bak, a rock musician, went the next day to Japan to perform at a concert in Okinawa. Clearly, there is a huge and interconnected cultural tie between both countries, a sort of grudging respect that's emerged. And as Jerry Brocklin argues in his 2009 book, Pacific Rivals, over the long run, this cultural tendency to intermingle is going to once again flower between both Japan and China, as the two countries first get closer, and second, begin to understand each other far better. But most important is underlined in the issue of immigration between the two countries. In his 2009 book, The History of the Next 100 Years, George Friedman argues that Japan has a declining population, and in order to have any sort of manufacturing capability in the future, is going to have to begin accepting more immigrants. Something it's already beginning to do in the case of China and Korea, but because of sheer numbers, mostly China. Just last year, as many as 100,000 Chinese immigrated to Japan, both for labor purposes and to add cultural ties between the two countries. As this immigration expands, understanding between the two countries will expand as well. And with more Chinese living in Japan and more Japanese living in China, on a cultural level, the two countries will begin to understand each other and relations will begin to improve. Clearly, the situation between Japan and China has in the past few years been frosty, and historically has been even worse. But thankfully, these recent protests are not a marker of the beginning of a worsened relation, but rather merely a highlight of the death of the old policy and the rebirth of better relations. So in posing today's question, are recent protests just the beginning of worsened Chinese-Japanese relations? The answer is fortunately not at all. Because first, there are improving political ties. Second, economic relations are getting far stronger. And finally, because the cultural ties between the two countries are on a daily level getting better. Clearly, Japan is yet to forget the rape of Nanking and overall Chinese expansions onto the Asian continent. And China, on a root level, likely hasn't forgotten the rape of Nanking. But both countries